Hannah Mercer left her home on a Saturday evening in the middle of May, a time when the days were long and the air was warm enough that windows in the neighborhood stood cracked open. She was 17, the kind of girl her parents described as reliable, cautious, and responsible. That night she was headed only a few blocks away to a friend's birthday party that had been planned for weeks. She told her parents she'd be back by 10. It was the type of promise that seemed so casual at the time, a daughter assuring her parents she would walk the familiar streets back home before it got too late. For her family, it was nothing more than an ordinary evening. But in hindsight, that ordinary promise became the last anchor of normal life before everything unraveled. The Mercer family remembered those hours with a kind of painful clarity. At first, 10 o'clock came and went without alarm. Hannah's father assumed she had lost track of time, and her mother thought perhaps the party was running later than expected. It was the kind of rationalization any parent makes when a teenager misses curfew by a few minutes. They gave her leeway, trusting she would come through the front door any moment with the sound of sneakers scuffing the hardwood floors. But as 10 stretched into 10:30, and then 11, unease crept in. Phone calls went unanswered, texts showed as delivered but never read. A voicemail was left, then another, each one more urgent than the last. By midnight, the tone inside the Mercer household shifted from irritation to worry, and by 1 in the morning, it had calcified into panic. They called Hannah's friends first, desperate for reassurance. Her best friend said she had last seen her leave the birthday gathering around 9:30, walking in the direction of home. The walk should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Others echoed the same story. Hannah hadn't seemed upset, hadn't mentioned plans to meet anyone else, hadn't appeared intoxicated or distracted. She simply walked out the door, waved goodbye, and disappeared into the dark. That was the moment where everything stopped making sense, because between the party and her home, there was barely half a mile of quiet suburban street. The gap between where she was last seen and where she should have arrived was impossibly small, and yet somewhere in that space, she had vanished. By 2 in the morning, her parents contacted the police. The dispatcher on the line asked the usual questions. How old was she? When had she been last seen? Did she have a history of running away? Her parents insisted that this was not a runaway situation. Hannah had left her wallet and her favorite jacket at home, the kind of things she would have taken if she'd planned to be gone for long. She was a good student, close to her family, and had never given them reason to believe she would simply leave without explanation. The officers promised to send a patrol car to take a report, but in those first hours it still sounded procedural, as if there would be a simple explanation and Hannah would turn up by morning. Her parents clung to that fragile belief, but deep down, both of them felt the creeping certainty that something was wrong. The neighborhood began to stir in those pre-dawn hours. Porch lights snapped on as officers walked door to door, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. A few neighbors recalled hearing dogs barking around the time Hannah should have been walking home. Someone else thought they heard a car engine revving and tires squealing on the nearby road, but no one could say for sure if it was connected. The street itself felt ordinary, unchanged, but in the Mercer family's eyes, it had become hostile, transformed into the place where their daughter had vanished, without a trace. Every corner, every shadow now seemed like a question mark. By sunrise, friends and relatives gathered at the Mercer home. Coffee brewed endlessly in the kitchen, but no one could bring themselves to drink it. They kept watching the front door, waiting for Hannah to appear with some explanation that would undo the nightmare. But the silence dragged on. Every hour that passed deepened the sense that she wasn't just late, she was missing. Her mother later described the feeling as if the world had tilted, as if time had broken into a before and after. Before that Saturday night, life was predictable, safe. After, every moment was filled with an absence that couldn't be explained. When the police returned later that morning to take a full report, they asked for recent photographs, clothing descriptions, and a list of her close contacts. Officers drove the short route between the birthday house and the Mercer home over and over again, looking for any sign, discarded belongings, footprints, anything to suggest what had happened in that brief stretch of road. But there was nothing. The street was clean, the sidewalks undisturbed, as if Hannah had walked into the night and simply dissolved. The first 24 hours of a missing person case are the most critical, and already the Mercer family felt those precious minutes slipping away. What began as a normal Saturday night had spiraled into something incomprehensible, something that would not resolve with a quick phone call or a relieved smile at the front door. Instead, it had become the start of a nightmare that would stretch far beyond that single night, a mystery that began in the most ordinary of ways, with a girl promising she'd be home by 10. The first full day of Hannah's disappearance unfolded with the disorienting rhythm of a nightmare that no one could wake from. By dawn, the Mercer home had transformed into a staging ground, with police cruisers lined along the curb and uniformed officers knocking on doors. Neighbors in pajamas stood on their porches, arms crossed against the morning chill as questions spread faster than answers. Everyone wanted to know how a girl could walk out of a birthday party onto a familiar street she had walked countless times before and fail to reach her own front door. It was a distance so short it felt impossible for her to have vanished without someone noticing, and yet that impossibility was the very fact investigators were now confronting. Detectives began by retracing Hannah's final known steps. The birthday party had been held at the Patterson home, less than half a mile away. Friends described the night as ordinary: laughter, music, cake, and all agreed that Hannah left just after 9:30. She wasn't upset, wasn't in a rush, and didn't mention meeting anyone. She had waved goodbye casually, as though nothing was amiss. For investigators, this detail was both comforting and deeply troubling. It meant she had left in good spirits, but it also meant there was no clear warning, no sign of trouble to point them in any direction. Canvassing the street turned up fragments of potential leads. One neighbor recalled hearing their dog barking incessantly around 10, though they assumed at the time it was reacting to a raccoon or another animal. Another swore they heard a car engine rev loudly and speed away, but when asked to describe the vehicle, their memory faltered. Too dark, too fast, too vague. These scraps of recollections formed a loose pattern, one that hinted at disturbance but offered no proof. Investigators took notes, logged statements, and marked maps, but there was no solid piece of evidence to build a case around. As word spread, volunteers from the community began arriving at the Mercer home, eager to help. Parents, teachers, classmates, and even strangers signed up for search groups. They combed the sidewalks, peeked into backyards, and scoured wooded areas along the route between the party and Hannah's home. Some carried flashlights, others handmade flyers bearing her photo. As the day stretched into afternoon, a growing army of concerned citizens walked the streets calling her name, their voices echoing through cul-de-sacs and across vacant lots. Search dogs were brought in by early evening, handlers guiding them carefully along the suspected path. At one point, the dogs seemed to react near the edge of the woods, noses pressed to the ground, but the trail evaporated just as quickly as it had begun. The lead fizzled, leaving behind only frustration and a fresh wave of dread. False sightings began almost immediately. A woman swore she saw Hannah at a gas station across town. Another caller insisted a girl matching her description was walking near the mall. Each report ignited hope, spurring frantic calls and quick deployments of patrol cars, but every single one collapsed under scrutiny. Security cameras showed different girls. The mall report came from someone who had confused her with another student. The gas station clerk had no memory of seeing her at all. The Mercer family clung to these sparks of hope each time, only to have them extinguished again and again, each false lead tightening the weight in their chests. By nightfall, the Mercers sat huddled in their living room, their home now crowded with officers, volunteers, and a whiteboard filled with times, locations, and dead ends. Every knock on the door made their hearts lurch. Every phone call sent a tremor of fear through them. They tried to tell themselves that Hannah would be found soon, that she would walk through the door with a story about getting lost, about a misunderstanding. But the quiet truth settled heavier with each hour. If she had only been walking a few blocks home, why hadn't she arrived? That first day ended with no answers. The streets were quieter, but the unease lingered in every shadow. A girl who should have been home in 10 minutes had been gone for nearly 24 hours. What began as disbelief had hardened into panic, and that panic was slowly curdling into a gnawing dread. The neighborhood that once felt safe was now threaded with fear. and the Mercer family could no longer cling to the comfort of ordinary explanations. Something had happened in the space between the birthday party and their front door, and until they found out what, every second without Hannah felt like an eternity they could not bear. By the third day of Hannah's disappearance, the investigation turned inward. With no physical evidence on the street and no reliable sightings, detectives began focusing on the people closest to her. In cases like these, the explanation is often found not in strangers, but in familiar circles: family friends, classmates, neighbors. The first questions were directed at the Pattersons, the family who had hosted the birthday party. Their home had been the last place Hannah was confirmed to be alive, and investigators wanted every detail about the night. Officers asked about the flow of the party, who was present, what time Hannah left, and whether anyone followed her out. The Pattersons cooperated, allowing their home to be searched, their phones checked, even their cars inspected. Nothing connected them to Hannah's disappearance, yet whispers in the neighborhood began to spread anyway, quietly pointing to them simply because they were the last ones to see her. As the Pattersons endured scrutiny, rumors took on a life of their own. Someone mentioned that Hannah had been texting with an older boy in the weeks before she vanished. He was 19, from a neighboring town, and he had a reputation for skipping school, getting into fights, and hanging around with people who made parents uneasy. It wasn't long before his name circulated among students and adults alike. Detectives tracked him down, questioned him about his connection to Hannah, and examined his phone records. He admitted they had been in touch, but denied meeting her that night. He said they had flirted, exchanged messages, but nothing more. To investigators, his story felt both plausible and suspicious, the kind of half-truth teenagers often give when they fear they'll be blamed. Without proof, however, they couldn't hold him. The possibility of a secret meeting between Hannah and this boy unsettled her parents deeply. They clung to the version of their daughter as responsible and grounded, someone who wouldn't sneak away into the night with an older teen they barely knew. But they were forced to consider the possibility that she'd been hiding parts of her life from them, like so many teenagers do. This fracture between what they believed about her and what might have been true gnawed at them, feeding into the guilt that already weighed them down. If she had been meeting him, had they missed the signs? Had they failed to protect her from a danger they should have seen coming? As days passed without answers, the community itself began to unravel under the strain. Parents who had once trusted each other at block parties and school events now looked at one another with suspicion. Some whispered that the Pattersons had known more than they let on. Others muttered about the boy from out of town. The lack of evidence meant that every rumor felt like a possibility, and every possibility became fuel for gossip. Teenagers were caught between defending their friends and fearing that someone among them was hiding the truth. In classrooms and cafeterias, conversations turned tense, with accusations thinly veiled as speculation. For the investigators, this breakdown created both opportunity and chaos. People who once hesitated to talk now offered theories freely, but the flood of rumors threatened to drown the few verifiable facts. Detectives tried to sift through statements, matching timelines against phone records, but every path seemed to end in contradiction. The boy's alibi was shaky but not disproven. The Pattersons' account was consistent, but left gaps. Each family clung to their innocence while glancing over their shoulders at neighbors who might one day be revealed as guilty. In the Mercer household, the weight of suspicion pressed heavily. Friends who had once been allies felt distant, conversations cut short, eyes averted. Hannah's mother described the change as a second loss, the loss of trust in the very community they had believed would keep their children safe. For her father, it fueled anger, a need to push harder for answers, to demand more from the police. But even as pressure mounted, detectives admitted they had no evidence strong enough to make an arrest. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance footage, nothing concrete that could move the case forward, and so suspicion hung in the air like a fog, thick, clinging, and impossible to dispel. Every parent asked themselves the same question in quiet moments. If Hannah could vanish on such a short walk home, could their own child be next? The uncertainty didn't just fracture friendships, it rewrote the atmosphere of the entire neighborhood. And behind it all lingered a gnawing truth. The person responsible might not be a stranger at all, but someone they already knew. A week into the search, when the Mercer family had already endured more sleepless nights than they could count, the investigation shifted from a search of streets and yards into the wooded trail that cut between the Patterson home and the Mercer house. It was a shortcut many kids in the neighborhood had used for years, a narrow path pressed into the earth by sneakers and bicycles, lined with tall trees that in daylight felt harmless. But in the context of Hannah's disappearance, it became a place of dread, the most obvious corridor where something terrible might have happened. Dozens of volunteers gathered there, equipped with flashlights, gloves, and bright orange vests. They moved in lines, combing through underbrush and scanning the ground for anything unusual. What they discovered turned the investigation in a darker direction. Near a bend in the trail, one of the searchers spotted a scrap of fabric caught on a low branch. It was pale in color, frayed at the edges, and immediately called to mind the shirt Hannah's parents had described her wearing that night. The item was collected carefully, bagged, and sent to the evidence team. Not far from it, a second fragment was found, torn and muddied, lying in the dirt as if it had been pulled away by force. These discoveries sent a ripple of shock through the group. Until then, the search had turned up nothing more than discarded bottles and candy wrappers, objects belonging to no one. But these pieces were different. They looked personal, connected, and possibly the first tangible sign of what had happened in the critical moments after Hannah left the party. When cadaver dogs were brought in to survey the same area, their behavior only deepened the sense of dread. Near the cluster of trees where the fabric had been found, several of the animals alerted strongly, noses buried in the soil, bodies rigid. Handlers marked the location, expecting that digging might reveal remains. But despite repeated sweeps and hours of probing, nothing surfaced. The dogs reacted, but there was no body. Investigators began to wonder if what they were detecting was trace scent, something that had once been there but was no longer present. That possibility was chilling in its own right, because it suggested Hannah had been there briefly, but had been taken elsewhere before the trail could go cold. For the Mercer family, news of the discovery came with conflicting emotions. On one hand, it was devastating to think that scraps of fabric in the woods might be all that was left of their daughter. On the other, it confirmed what they had insisted all along, that Hannah hadn't run away, that something had happened to her against her will. The discovery moved the case from a missing person into the darker realm of possible abduction or foul play. The police presence in the neighborhood grew, with crime scene tapes stretched across parts of the trail and evidence markers dotting the ground. What had once been a place where children played hide and seek was now cordoned off as a suspected crime scene. As the fragments were analyzed, investigators concluded that the material did match the general description of Hannah's clothing. Yet there was no blood, no conclusive DNA, no fingerprints, nothing definitive that could confirm beyond doubt that it belonged to her. This uncertainty frustrated the detectives, who were now caught between treating it as a breakthrough and recognizing it might still be coincidence. The Mercer family clung to the likelihood that the pieces were hers, unable to believe that the timing and location could mean anything else. Detectives began reconstructing a new theory, that Hannah had taken the wooded trail home as expected, but somewhere along the path she was confronted. The torn fabric suggested a struggle, possibly that she had been grabbed or dragged. The dog's alerts indicated her presence at least briefly, but the lack of a body led investigators to suspect she had been forced into a vehicle nearby. This scenario made sense of the car engine sounds reported by neighbors, weaving those vague recollections into a possible timeline. It painted a grim picture of abduction carried out in a matter of seconds, hidden in the darkness of a suburban path no one thought twice about. The discovery of the fabric had consequences beyond the investigation. The trail, once a communal space, became a place parents forbade their children from entering. Its entrance was avoided, its shadows whispered about. Where kids had once biked freely, silence now hung heavy. Every family in the neighborhood recognized that something horrific had likely taken place there, and that recognition changed the way they looked at their own streets. Fear settled in, not just for Hannah, but for what her disappearance meant about the safety of all their children. The woods themselves seemed to hold a secret no one could fully uncover. Detectives continued to revisit the site, to map it, to analyze, but each return yielded the same emptiness. The fragments of fabric stood as the only possible trace of Hannah in that place, maddeningly incomplete, agonizingly insufficient to answer the central question of where she had gone next. And so, the case lingered on the threshold of revelation, hinting at answers but refusing to provide them, while Hannah's family and community were left staring into the trees, desperate to believe the silence there would one day be broken by truth. The trail discovery had barely settled when investigators shifted their attention toward a man who lived just 2 blocks from where Hannah was last seen. His name had already been whispered in the neighborhood, someone whose past was marked by a criminal record that made him an easy target for suspicion. Years earlier, he had been arrested for possession of explicit material and had a reputation for keeping to himself. He was the kind of figure who made parents uneasy, the kind who seemed to fit the story everyone feared, that a predator had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for a chance to strike. Detectives, under pressure to deliver results, began building their case around him. Surveillance teams parked unmarked cars near his home, watching his comings and goings. They interviewed neighbors, who were quick to recall odd behaviors, lights flickering late at night, heavy trash bags carried out at strange hours, and dogs barking whenever he walked by. Every recollection was colored by hindsight, every memory sharpened by fear. To the investigators, it looked like a pattern, and soon they were convinced enough to secure a warrant. On a gray morning, patrol cars pulled into the street, officers knocking loudly before entering the man's house. The entire neighborhood watched from their windows, holding their breath, believing this was the moment the nightmare would break open. What they found inside shocked even seasoned officers. The rooms were cluttered and suffocating, stacks of newspapers and boxes piled high. In one corner, they uncovered disturbing but unrelated material, photographs, tapes, and journals that hinted at dark obsessions. The details were never released publicly in full, but what leaked was enough to ignite a firestorm. News vans crowded the block within hours, broadcasting live reports of a person of interest. Headlines painted him as the villain before any charges had been filed. For Hannah's family, the sudden burst of coverage stirred both dread and fragile hope. Could this be the answer? Had the man living so close been holding the secret all along? But as investigators worked through the evidence, the cracks in the theory began to show. None of the items directly tied to Hannah. DNA tests came back negative. The disturbing material was indeed criminal in nature, but it pointed to unrelated offenses, not the abduction of a teenage girl. His alibi for the night of the disappearance, unimpressive though it seemed at first, checked out under scrutiny. Records placed him in another part of town, miles from the trail at the critical window of time. What looked like a breakthrough had dissolved into a dead end, leaving detectives with nothing more than a collection of unrelated crimes that would never explain Hannah's disappearance. The public, however, wasn't as quick to let go. Once the man's name had been whispered on the evening news, he was branded guilty in the minds of many. Parents whispered warnings, children crossed the street to avoid his house, and angry words were muttered at town meetings. The Mercer family was caught in the middle of it, yearning for answers, but realizing that what seemed like resolution was only illusion. They had to endure the roller coaster of hope, believing they were finally close to justice, only to have it collapse into uncertainty again. Hannah's mother later said that this period was worse than the silence. At least with silence, they knew nothing. Here, they thought they had the truth, and then it was ripped away. For investigators, the collapse of this lead was devastating. They had poured resources into the search, risked their credibility by focusing so heavily on one suspect, and allowed the media to run ahead with speculation. Now, without evidence to tie him to Hannah, they were back at square one. The community began to lose faith, murmuring that the police had mishandled the case, that they had chased the wrong man while the real culprit slipped further out of reach. Trust between neighbors, already fragile, began to fracture further. Every family wondered if the danger still lived among them, if the person responsible was still walking free, still attending the same grocery store, the same church, the same neighborhood events. The man at the center of the storm was eventually cleared, but he was never truly freed. His reputation remained ruined, his face tied to headlines that never bothered to correct themselves with the same force they had accused. The entire ordeal served as a reminder of how easily desperation for answers can blur the line between suspicion and proof. For the Mercer family, it was another layer of torment, watching a man be torn apart publicly, only to realize it brought them no closer to finding Hannah. As the dust settled, the case collapsed back into the same aching uncertainty it had started with. The search boards were still blank, the questions still unanswered. What little trust remained in the investigation began to fray. Neighbors who had once volunteered eagerly now avoided eye contact, tired of false hope and broken promises. And as another week passed with no sign of Hannah, the silence in the Mercer home grew heavier, pressing down like a weight no one could lift. As the months slipped into years, the investigation into Hannah Mercer's disappearance began to wither under the weight of silence. The tips slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Detectives rotated to new assignments, their once daily presence around the Mercer home reduced to an occasional call, a perfunctory update that offered nothing new. For the family, each day bled into the next, marked not by breakthroughs or progress, but by absence, an absence that settled over their house like dust, thick and unmoving. Hannah's room was left untouched, a shrine to a life that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Her bed remained made, posters still clung to the walls, clothes still folded in drawers. Her mother vacuumed the carpet, changed the sheets, and opened the curtains each morning, as if keeping the space alive would somehow tether her daughter back to the world she had vanished from. The Mercer family refused to leave their home, even when friends suggested that moving might lessen their pain. They couldn't bear the idea of Hannah returning one day to find them gone. The house became both their prison and their vigil, a place where hope flickered like a stubborn flame that refused to extinguish. Her father threw himself into every possible lead, writing letters to reporters, pressing investigators for updates, and attending community meetings. Her mother, quieter in her grief, began to retreat inward, her once bright energy dulled into a kind of numb perseverance. Both carried the weight differently, but both carried it constantly, every moment defined by the empty space where Hannah should have been. Meanwhile, life around them moved forward with a cruel kind of normalcy. Hannah's classmates graduated high school, then college, their milestones marked in photographs and announcements that arrived in the mail. Some moved away for jobs, marriages, new lives, but Hannah remained frozen at 17 in the memories of those who had known her. At reunions and gatherings, her name was spoken in hushed tones, as if saying it too loudly might awaken something painful. For her friends, the years only deepened the surreal divide between their adult selves and the girl who had been walking home from a birthday party one night and never arrived. Each anniversary of her disappearance became a ritual of both remembrance and torment. Vigils were held at the local church, candles arranged in trembling lines of light, prayers offered into the cool evening air. Posters with her face, now faded at the edges, were reprinted and distributed. Strangers came, alongside neighbors and classmates, gathering in silence to honor the girl who had not returned. But every vigil also reopened wounds, reminding the community of the unanswered questions that lingered like ghosts. The rituals gave shape to grief, but they also sharpened the unbearable fact that nothing had changed. Rumors, too, refused to die. Whispers crept through the town like vines. Some said she had run away, that she had been tired of her small-town life and had taken the first chance to leave. Others insisted she had been taken, but that the truth was buried, covered up by mistakes in the investigation or secrets the community wasn't ready to face. For the Mercers, these rumors cut as deeply as the silence, twisting their pain into questions they could not answer. To believe she had run away meant believing she had chosen to leave them. To believe she had been silenced by a cover-up meant believing the system had failed her beyond repair. Either way, the theories left them powerless, condemned to imagine horrors without proof. The town itself began to change under the weight of her absence. The wooded trail where fabric had once been found grew over, avoided by children who had heard the stories whispered in their homes. The neighbor once branded a suspect still lived under a shadow, though he had been cleared, his name forever tied to a case unresolved. Parents became more cautious, driving their children short distances rather than letting them walk. Fear seeped into ordinary routines, shaping choices long after the search had ended. For investigators, Hannah's case became another entry in a growing list of unsolved disappearances, filed under cold. Evidence boxes were sealed and stored, their contents gathering dust in archives. Every few years, a new detective might revisit the file, flipping through notes, hoping that fresh eyes might see something missed. But without new evidence, there was little to be done. Time itself had become the enemy, erasing memories, degrading evidence, and dulling urgency. Yet despite the silence, the Mercer family never stopped waiting. They marked each birthday with a cake no one ate, each holiday with an empty chair. Her mother sometimes swore she heard the creak of Hannah's footsteps in the hallway, a fleeting sound that dissolved into silence. Her father admitted he often dreamed of her, sometimes alive, sometimes gone, but always unreachable. These fragments of presence, real or imagined, became the closest thing they had to their daughter. Years passed, but the mystery remained suspended in the same agonizing place. Hannah was neither alive nor dead in the eyes of those who loved her, neither here nor gone. Her absence was the only certainty. And as the town tried to move forward, the Mercers could not. For them, time had stopped on that night she walked home from a birthday party and never returned, leaving behind a silence that stretched endlessly, swallowing everything else. 14 years after Hannah Mercer vanished, when most in town had resigned themselves to the idea that her fate might never be known, the case jolted back to life in the most unexpected way. On Pine Street, only a few blocks from where Hannah had last been seen, a young couple had purchased a decaying old house with plans to renovate it. The property had sat neglected for years, the kind of place neighbors described as haunted not by ghosts, but by mold, sagging floors, and peeling paint. Its history was unremarkable, passed between owners who never seemed to stay long. The couple saw potential in it, a place they could strip down and rebuild into something new. But in the course of their renovations, they uncovered something that stopped them cold. In the basement, behind a wall of plaster and mismatched paneling, they discovered a door that didn't appear on any blueprints. The door itself was old, wooden, and sealed shut with rusted nails driven deep into the frame. At first, they thought it was just part of the house's patchwork construction, a forgotten storage space or storm shelter. But curiosity, mixed with unease, compelled them to pry it open. The effort released a wave of stale, heavy air that poured out into the basement, carrying with it a foulness that had clearly been trapped for years. It was not the smell of decay, so much as the stench of abandonment, of something hidden that had not seen light in decades. When they shined their flashlight inside, what they saw was not a storage closet, but a cellar. Small, low-ceilinged, dug into the earth like a burrow. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp. The walls were unpainted concrete, smeared with discoloration that time had turned into shadows. Scattered across the ground were discarded items, objects that made the couple's stomachs turn. Torn clothing, worn shoes, and bits of fabric lay in piles as if tossed carelessly aside. There were personal belongings too, a cracked hairbrush, the remains of a backpack, and the tarnished edge of a locket. It didn't take long for them to realize that these were not just forgotten possessions from a family long past, but something more sinister. Shaken, the couple backed out and called the police. Within hours, the quiet block was transformed into a scene of flashing lights and cordoned-off tape. Officers in gloves and masks descended into the cellar with evidence kits and cameras, treating it as a crime scene frozen in time. The house, once a project of promise, had become a place of horror. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief, many remembering Hannah's disappearance all those years ago. The discovery was only a few blocks from where she had last been seen, and the proximity was impossible to ignore. Detectives moved quickly to compare the recovered items with Hannah's case file. Among the clothing was a pale blouse, eerily similar to the one she'd been wearing the night she disappeared. The locket was engraved with initials that matched her own. Other belongings, though degraded by time and damp, bore enough resemblance to things her parents had described that investigators felt an icy certainty settling over them. The cellar had been connected to Hannah, and suddenly a case long frozen in silence surged back into motion. For the Mercer family, the phone call came late that night. Police explained what had been found, careful with their words, unwilling to give promises until forensic testing confirmed everything. But even in their cautious phrasing, the implication was clear. After 14 years, evidence tied to their daughter had finally been unearthed. Hannah's mother described the moment as a shattering of the fragile balance she had built over the years. She had lived with absence, with not knowing, and now she was forced to confront proof that her daughter had been so close, hidden just streets away. For her father, it was rage more than grief, the anger that such evidence had lain beneath the feet of neighbors and police for years, unseen and undisturbed. As officers cataloged the cellar, the picture that formed was chilling. It wasn't just a hidden room, it was a deliberate space, concealed carefully behind false walls. Someone had sealed it with the intent that it would never be found. The objects inside suggested not a single moment of violence, but something prolonged, drawn out, something calculated. That possibility was almost too much to bear. The Mercer family had begged for closure for more than a decade, but the discovery of the cellar opened new questions, ones darker than before. The house itself became a spectacle overnight. Reporters camped outside, broadcasting live updates, their voices heavy with the suggestion that Hannah's mystery had finally been solved. But in truth, what had been found was not resolution, but another beginning. The evidence was undeniable, but it didn't explain who had built the cellar, who had used it, or why Hannah's belongings had been left there. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, but the passage of 14 years meant that much of what might have been useful was degraded beyond recovery. The items were haunting, but they were not answers. For the community, the discovery was a rupture. Pine Street was just another suburban block, indistinguishable from dozens of others in town. To realize that such a horror had been concealed within it for years unsettled everyone who had once believed the danger was somewhere far away. Parents who had allowed themselves to relax after years of quiet were thrown back into fear. Neighbors who had lived near the house all those years asked themselves how they could have missed the signs. The cellar forced everyone to confront a truth that was almost unbearable. The mystery of Hannah Mercer had never left. It had been buried in the heart of their own neighborhood, waiting to be uncovered. Forensic teams moved into the Pine Street house with a precision that bordered on ritual, aware that after 14 years the smallest trace could mean everything. The cellar, sealed away from light and air for so long, was a trove of potential evidence, though degraded and fragile. Specialists in white suits and masks cataloged each item carefully, photographing before touching, bagging even the most ordinary scrap of fabric. The stale air seemed to cling to them, heavy with the weight of secrets buried for over a decade. What they uncovered confirmed the Mercer family's worst fears, but offered none of the peace they had long hoped for. Among the belongings recovered, one object stood out immediately, a silver locket engraved with the initials HM. Inside was a faded photo of Hannah as a child, her face still visible despite the corrosion. For detectives, it was the first definitive link between Hannah and the cellar. Weeks later, DNA testing on strands of hair found tangled in the dirt floor returned positive for Hannah as well, removing any last doubt. She had been there. The space wasn't speculation anymore, it was fact. The revelation tore through the community like a shockwave, proving that Hannah hadn't disappeared into some unknown elsewhere, but had been hidden close by all along. Yet the discovery brought no body, no remains to answer the most painful questions. There were fingerprints on some of the belongings, but time and moisture had blurred them beyond use. Smudges without ridges, fragments without patterns. Whoever had used the cellar had taken precautions, wiping surfaces, sealing it away, ensuring that if it were ever discovered, the trail would be faint at best. Investigators knew they were dealing with someone methodical, someone who had gone to great lengths to hide not just Hannah, but any sign of themselves. The lack of direct evidence forced detectives to widen their search. They began pulling records of the house itself, tracing back its chain of ownership. Over the 14 years since Hannah vanished, the property had changed hands multiple times. Some owners stayed only briefly, selling after a year or two, citing repairs too costly or the difficulty of maintaining such an old structure. Others had rented it out, tenants coming and going with little paper trail. The chain was complex, muddied, and incomplete, each gap another layer of frustration. Pinpointing who might have sealed the cellar or used it became a puzzle with missing pieces. The discovery reignited public speculation. Neighbors who had once whispered theories now came forward with memories sharpened by hindsight. Some recalled construction noises late at night, hammering that didn't fit the usual rhythm of household repairs. Others mentioned odd smells drifting from the house years earlier, dismissed at the time as mildew. Every recollection hinted at hidden activity, but never coalesced into proof. Detectives logged them all, knowing that after so much time, memory was as unreliable as it was haunting. For the Mercer family, the confirmation that their daughter had been inside that cellar was devastating. It ended the fragile hope that she might have simply run away and built a life elsewhere. It proved she had been trapped, that she had suffered in a place terrifyingly close to home, but it did not tell them who had done it, how long she had been there, or what her final moments might have been. They were left with evidence that explained nothing, fragments of truth that only deepened the mystery. The house itself became a symbol of betrayal. Neighbors drove by slowly, staring at the yellow tape and boarded windows, wondering how such horror could have been hidden in plain sight. Reporters filled the airwaves with theories, each broadcast amplifying the story of the locket, the hair, the cellar that had held Hannah's presence but not her body. The Mercer family found themselves caught between relief that pieces of her had finally been found and despair that those pieces were all they had. Detectives pressed forward, subpoenaing records, interviewing every past owner they could locate, and digging into tenant histories. But the longer they looked, the clearer it became that the cellar had likely been concealed long before many of those owners ever walked through the front door. Whoever had built it had ensured it could pass unnoticed through generations of turnover, a dark secret embedded into the bones of the house. It was chilling to realize that families may have lived above it, unaware of what lay beneath their feet, raising children while a sealed door hid evidence of another child who never came home. The cellar had given investigators proof, but not resolution. Hannah had been there. That was undeniable. But who had put her there, how she had arrived, and where she had gone afterward remained maddeningly unanswered. And as the weeks wore on, detectives knew the trail, already thin, was slipping further from reach, leaving behind only the haunting certainty that the truth had been buried deliberately and expertly for years. The discovery of the cellar did more than confirm Hannah had once been there. It cracked open a flood of questions that no one was prepared to face. In the absence of answers, theories multiplied, each one darker than the last. Was the hidden room simply a place to store what had been left of her, or had it been something far more sinister? The locket and strands of hair proved she had been inside, but nothing revealed for how long. Some whispered that Hannah might have been alive there for days, maybe weeks before her fate was sealed. The thought was unbearable, and yet it lodged itself into the minds of her family and community, an infection of imagination that refused to be cured. Neighbors began replaying the past with painful new clarity. One recalled hearing hammering at odd hours years earlier, sounds they had assumed were routine repairs. Another remembered odors that drifted across their yard, foul and heavy, dismissed at the time as mildew from an old house. Each recollection, harmless when it first occurred, became sinister in hindsight. Together, these fragments painted a picture that was as horrifying as it was incomplete. People asked themselves why they hadn't pressed harder, why they hadn't looked closer. If someone had, would Hannah have been saved? The collective guilt seeped into the neighborhood, a sense that the crime had unfolded not only in darkness, but in silence, aided by their own failure to notice. For the Mercer family, the theories became an endless cycle of torment. Hannah's mother lay awake at night, imagining her daughter trapped only blocks from home, waiting for someone to find her, while search parties scoured forests and rivers miles away. The possibility that Hannah had been so close, alive, scared, and unheard was almost too much to bear. Her father tried to resist speculation, grounding himself in the facts investigators had confirmed, but even he admitted that the questions haunted him. If the cellar had been a holding place, what had Hannah endured inside those concrete walls? If she hadn't died there, where had she gone when the space was finally sealed? The absence of answers only sharpened the edges of grief. The cellar itself became a symbol, not just of Hannah's suffering, but of something larger. Reporters described it as a chamber of horror, a hidden scar in the center of an otherwise ordinary neighborhood. Parents drove their children past it as a warning, a reminder of the dangers that lurked closer than anyone wanted to believe. It represented secrecy, fear, and the chilling fact that evil had operated under their noses while the community convinced itself it was safe. Candlelight vigils were held outside the boarded-up home, mourners leaving flowers and notes, their flickering candles casting eerie light on the foundation of the house that had concealed the truth for so long. Police, too, were haunted by the implications. Detectives who had worked the case in its early days admitted privately that the discovery gnawed at them. They had scoured fields, drained ponds, and followed endless false leads, never once realizing that Hannah's traces lay hidden behind a nailed door only a short walk from where she vanished. Some retired officers confessed to sleepless nights, wondering if their oversight had cost Hannah her chance at survival. Though no one could prove she had lived beyond the night she disappeared, the possibility was enough to erode whatever sense of closure they might have found in their careers. The community's imagination filled every gap the evidence left behind. Some were convinced the cellar was a makeshift prison, that Hannah had been held captive there for reasons no one could understand. Others believed it had been a place to store her belongings, a staging ground for whoever was responsible before moving her body elsewhere. A more unsettling theory gained traction, that the cellar had not been used only once, but repeatedly, for victims other than Hannah. The locket and clothing linked her undeniably to the space, but there were other items too, fragments that could not be matched to her. That possibility, that she had not been the only one, spread like wildfire, layering horror on top of grief. As theories spiraled, the Mercer family found themselves suffocating under the weight of what-ifs. They had lived with silence for 14 years, but silence at least had allowed them to imagine Hannah free somewhere, living under a different name, building a hidden life. Now the silence was filled with images of walls closing in, of their daughter calling out just blocks away, unheard. The cellar didn't just reopen old wounds, it deepened them, driving them further into nightmares that left no room for peace. And so, Pine Street became synonymous with dread. The cellar stood as a reminder of how close the truth had been all along, how evil had been hidden in the very heart of the neighborhood. Every glance at the boarded windows and overgrown yard became an exercise in collective guilt, a reminder that while people had searched the woods and rivers, the answer had been concealed in plain sight. Theories could not be proved, nightmares could not be quieted, and the space beneath that house remained an open wound for all who had once believed Hannah Mercer had simply walked into the night and disappeared.